Our guest today is Greg Brown, founder of Activate, a microschool based in Portland, Oregon. Greg began his teaching career as a special education teacher in the Portland Public School District, but he quickly discovered that his master's program didn't prepare him to be an effective literacy teacher. So he pursued Orton Gillingham training, which is a phonics-based multisensory reading intervention especially useful for dyslexic students. In the summer of 2019, after 15 years of teaching in the Portland Public School District, Greg resigned to pursue his microschool, Activate, full time. And during COVID, Activate really gained additional popularity and interest from Portland area families. So it's now continuing to expand and grow. It is a full-time microschool with a dyslexia focus. And I'm so glad to welcome Greg Brown to the LiberatED podcast. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure listening to your podcast and listening to other microschool founders like myself. I actually don't know any other people who are on a path like mine. So listening to your podcast is inspiring and helpful to me, so I can hear other people's stories, which are a lot like mine.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, I'm inspired every day when I talk to education entrepreneurs like you who are creating these incredible learning models. And I find that many, if not most, of the microschool founders I talk to and education entrepreneurs are former public school teachers. Maybe it's that you see how the sausage gets made in the conventional classroom, and then you discover that you can do things different. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your pathway. What made you decide to go into education to begin with? And then we can talk about why you decided to leave that conventional classroom to build something else.
Mm-hmm. My first experience working with kids was actually during summer camps in the summers in between my college years. And I really enjoyed the work. In college, I focused on media arts and pursued that for a little while after graduating, after getting my undergrad. And I was looking for more stable employment as I kind of got into my mid to late 20s, and I went back to school to become a teacher because I had such fond memories of working with kids. I found that when I was working summer camps as a teenager, I was always sort of drawn to the kids that were maybe a little quirkier than the others. And I decided to pursue special education because I was just fascinated by that field. And I also knew that finding employment as a special education teacher would be pretty easy. So that was part of the motivation behind that too. My first teaching positions were in special ed, and then I moved to regular ed. I made that transition because I felt like I felt as though I could better meet the needs of my students if I just had them all day long instead of just pulling them out of class for a little while. And you had mentioned that I also did Orton Gillingham training at some point because I realized I just wasn't a very good reading teacher. I don't think most master's programs really teach that particularly well. And I taught in a variety of different schools, mostly hovered around 3rd and 4th grade, because those were always my favorites. And throughout my teaching career, there's always some side hustles going on. There's always some tutoring or some summer camps happening. In 2017, I formed Activate, and it was just a summer camp it was just an arts-based summer camp because I like doing art with kids and I liked having that extra income during the summer. And I was also doing a little bit of tutoring on the side. I think in 2018, I got a live workspace, and the workspace was used for tutoring. And I was still teaching full time, but just, had a few tutoring gigs after school. But I'd also use that space for some small kind of art programs and things like that. And 2000, 2019, I resigned from teaching because I just was feeling a lot more passionate about the camp and about the tutoring. I liked the autonomy that I had. And I was just growing kind of increasingly frustrated with the way that, standard schools operate. I didn't start the Microschool though right away. So my original plan was, what I did is I rented out a small space. It was about 700 square feet. So it was a step up from the live work space. And the original plan was to do tutoring and after school programs and camps out of that space. And that was so I rented that space in the summer of 2019 is when I moved in. So for the fall of 2020 and the winter of 2020, I was doing that. I was doing camps and after school programs and tutoring. Then when COVID hit in 2020, I just went completely to online tutoring all day long. Around this time, I started to transition away from the Orton-Gillingham approach and was exploring structured word inquiry, which is another approach to, it's another framework that can be used for all students, but especially for students with dyslexia. So in 2020, when COVID lockdowns started, I was just doing tutoring online all day long for that whole spring. And then in the summer, I started to operate summer camps. There was a lot of COVID guidelines that I had to follow, but we were wearing masks and doing temperature checks and doing the screening questions as kids were coming in. The camps had to be capped at 10 because of the COVID guidelines. And around that time, sort of at the beginning of the summer, a lot of parents were coming to me and asking me to create a learning pod for the fall. And what their vision is that they would, send kids to my space and they would get their Chromebooks out and do their online learning through their public school. And I would sort of just be hovering around and helping them out. And I really had absolutely no interest in doing that because I just couldn't envision what that would be like for myself or for them. And I just said, I'll just start up a school. And there was plans to start up Activate School well before this. I think I registered the name Activate School, I think in 2018, because it was always sort of part of the plan. I just didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. But because I had this network of parents who were asking me to do something in person, and a lot of the kids were dyslexic, I just figured that it was sort of the time to do it. So in Oregon, businesses like mine could register to be emergency childcare centers, which would allow us to have kids in person, even when the guidelines were saying that schools had to be closed. And there was a lot of guidelines that we had to follow. So I went through that process, became an emergency childcare center. So I was allowed to have kids in person. And we did in-person school. It was for 3rd and 4th grade that first year. And then the next year, which was last year, it was 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. Almost all the kids stayed, even though their schools went back in person. My lease ended over the summer. So I moved into a new space that's about 3 times the size, because it was a little challenging doing school in a 700 square foot space, especially as the kids got bigger and grew into 5th graders. It became even more challenging as they were just physically taking up a lot more space. We made it work, but it was hard. We have passenger vans too, so we were able just to go on field trips and just kind of travel all over the city and outside of the city too. So in this past summer, I moved into the larger space, and there's more staff. We have more kids. I still want to keep it small. I have no intention of growing it into much larger than it is. And that's the story so far.
Amazing. What a great story, Greg. You know, it's so similar to the experience of other education entrepreneurs who I've had on this podcast, as I'm sure you know, but especially similar to Pam McEwen in Wichita, Kansas, who, like you, was a longtime public school teacher who had started a tutoring center. And then when the COVID shutdowns and remote learning occurred, her parents urged her to open up a full-time microschool, and kind of that evolution from a tutoring program and tutoring center to a full-time microschool. And similar to your experience too, that even as schools reopened, her parents decided to stay, and she continues to grow as well. So great to see that common thread. There's so much that we could dig into, but what I'd love to do is go back to your experience in working in public elementary schools. That's where you said you spent most of your time. And what were you encountering there? Because I know you mentioned that you spent time in kind of third and fourth grade classrooms, and third grade is really an interesting time in conventional schools because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's typically the time where the curriculum shifts from learning to read to reading to learn. And so especially with your focus on literacy development, I imagine that was quite interesting for you to see that flip and working with students to kind of catch up to these curriculum expectations, even if they may not have been kind of developmentally ready on that path. So I'd love to hear more about your experience kind of working with kids in the conventional system, and what were you finding to be increasingly frustrating about that?
Yeah. So I worked at a few different schools. The first few schools that I worked at were all Title I schools. And, you know, typically they were schools with lower state test scores. The last school that I worked at was a pretty high SES school and had, you know, really strong state test scores. So it was nice seeing the variety and having that experience. One of the things that was frustrating was the idea that we're just going to use one curricula for all of the kids, regardless of what school. So when I was at these lower SES schools, we were given curriculum to use. And then when I go to the high SES schools, they were told to do the exact same thing, even though the needs of these children are very, very different. So that was one problem, just this notion that we're just going to use one curriculum, regardless of the kids and the school, and you know, it's just not effective. Also, our school district adopted the Lucy Calkins units of study, which is widely discredited. At the time that it was adopted, I was actually on this big committee to adopt or to pilot curriculum, and we were there was maybe like 30-40 teachers who were piloting two different programs. So like one group got the Lucy Calkins program, another group got something else that was really similar to the Lucy Calkins program. And then what we had to do is use that curriculum with our students and take notes, and then we would meet and discuss which one was better. And I was just like, well, they're both awful. Like neither one of these is effective. You know, it was just expected that by the time kids got into third grade, that they mastered all of the mechanics of reading, which we know no third grader has done that ever. You know, there's always more to learn. And I was fairly irate that these were our two options that we had to choose from, and they were both just equally bad. So we were really forced to use those programs. I would integrate a lot of other things because I just realized that my students and this was at a high achieving, high SES school. And, you know, there's still like this curriculum is just not helping kids to become stronger readers at all. So that was one of the huge, that was a major catalyst for me to get out of the public school system. But I was also I felt like the days are just cut up into these really small fragments, and you're just constantly going from one thing to the other. It's very hectic, chaotic. You're always having to look at the clock to make sure that you get to the next thing on time, whether it be recess or PE or library. Oftentimes the kids are finally really immersed in something, and then you just have to stop right there and move to something else. There's no flexibility. And I felt like, from the very top, there's a sense of kind of anxiety and chaos, and then it just sort of trickles down to everyone else, and the parents feel it too. And I just needed to get out of that situation. I just couldn't envision myself doing that for another 20, 30 years.
So before you resigned, you said that you started running Activate as summer camp programs, which probably provided you with more of that flexible, free learning that you were looking for, and started to do a little bit of tutoring. And what was it like when you ultimately decided to leave your teaching position? Because I think I have a lot of listeners who are probably are currently in the footsteps that you were in terms of, should I go? What will that be like? I'm dissatisfied here. I'm disillusioned with what I'm seeing in the classroom. But to make that jump into resigning and then starting something entrepreneurial can be difficult, can be really challenging and intimidating. So what was that like for you when you decided to make that shift?
Yeah, and I just want to add one more thing, and like another reason for wanting to leave is I was running the summer camp out of the school that I was working at. So I was actually just renting out my own classroom space from the school district. And what I saw was that, so most of the kids that went to my summer camp were kids that I knew. Like a lot of them were my students from previous years, or were the little siblings of students. So, I would say 90, or they were just kids that I would see around the school. So it's about 90% of the kids that would come into my summer camp were kids that I already knew. And I noticed just a major difference between how they were during the school year and how they were during summer camps. During school, they just seemed a lot more stressed. They seemed less apt to take risks. They seemed more anxious. And in summer camp, they just seemed so much more relaxed. They were just happier. And I was like, well, I need to start a school in which eventually I need to start a school in which I can capture that vibe of summer camp where the kids are happy and relaxed. And because these are the same kids that I'm seeing, and there's such a difference between, and it's the same building, the same room, the same adult, but yet the kids are so different during the school year and during summer camp. So moving, it was a little terrifying, but I felt like I had a good plan. I had some money saved up because I was teaching, I taught with the district for long enough. So I was at the top of the pay scale. And then when I was doing summer camps, all of that was just extra income on top of what I was already getting in my salary. So I had some money saved, and I worked out the numbers on spreadsheets, and everything seemed to work out. So it was terrifying, but I also knew that I would always be able to fall back on something. As a private tutor, finding clients is not hard. It's like my tutoring waiting list got ridiculously long, like over 100 people on it. So I knew that the clientele was there, and I knew that after school programs are popular. So it was scary to give up a regular paycheck and to give up the good benefits. But I always knew that I could fall back on something, and again, I have a degree in special ed and I'm certified in special ed, and I can always just drop what I'm doing and find work in that field. And in a way, when I was teaching with the school district, just knowing that was really liberating to me, knowing that I could just leave and find some other employment because I kind of had some backup plans. I always found that to be really comforting. And I try to instill that in other teachers that I know. I'm like, well, just know that, like, just kind of have a little bit of a backup plan, because it's liberating knowing that you're able to move on to something else if you really need to.
Right, having that sense that you can go back to a conventional classroom if it doesn't work out, that teachers are in such high demand that it shouldn't be difficult to go back into a public school system if whatever entrepreneurial adventure doesn't work out. That is right. That is comforting. I also like that your story includes kind of this incremental approach to working up toward your microschool, not only running the tutoring programs and the summer camps, but also the after school program too. And that's another theme that I noted, certainly in my unschooled book, when I looked at self-directed learning centers across the country, that sometimes these full-time microschools evolved from popular summer camps or after school programs, or like I mentioned, Pam's program, the tutoring center. So when you left in 2019 and then ran this after school summer camp and tutoring program, you said that you were thinking always about opening up Activate School as a full-time microschool, but not sure kind of when that would happen. Then, of course, COVID hits and provides that catalyst for you. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about um, how you how you came to your educational philosophy. Was it sort of all at once? You had to figure out what you were going to do in this full-time microschool. I know you said that it's a blend of self-directed education, which of course is my preferred educational philosophy, but you also bring in some teacher-directed resources and instruction, and it's a nice hybrid model. And I just wonder how that came to you. Is it something that you planned out for quite a while, or were you just thrust into it when you created this microschool during that COVID year?
Yeah, it's been going through my head for a long time. I've never worked in a fully self-directed education school or program. I've always wanted to do some more observations in those programs too. And I've been reading about SDE for a long time, like A.S. Neil's work and Peter Gray, and I'd say about half the books on my bookshelf that are like teacher related relate to that, and the other half relate to dyslexia. So in my beliefs about self-directed education, I think there are schools out there that are doing wonderful things, and I think that model is terrific for a lot of students and families. But I don't think that model works for every single student and every single family. And I don't think the traditional model works for all students and all families either. And I don't think that Activate works for all students and all families. But I do see that there can be a middle ground between a full self-directed education model and something with some teacher-directed, time integrated as well. I think, not all of the students here are dyslexic. About half of them are. And I think for students with dyslexia, having instruction, fairly explicit instruction and literacy is pretty important. I know that there are a lot of dyslexic kids in SDE models. A lot of them get outside tutoring. None of my students get outside tutoring because they get the literacy instruction that they need at school. So the model has it's been something that I've been pondering and considering for a long time, and it seems to be working for the community that I have here.
Amazing. So, Greg, how many kids do you have? How many learners do you have right now? I know you expanded to a larger space earlier last year. What are the demographics now in terms of who you have, what ages, and how many staff, and so on? Yeah.
We have 16 students now. We have room for 2 more, so we're capping it at 18. And we have, so I work the whole school day. There's a math teacher who comes in and works in the morning, So, and then there's someone else who comes in midday and helps out in the afternoons, and that person also does our aftercare program. We have second, third, fourth, and fifth grade now. And the way that we do math and literacy is the second and third graders do math with the math teacher, the fourth and fifth graders do literacy with me, and then we switch. And in the afternoons, we do what we call like workshop, where we study one thing for the whole month. And a lot of that we do whole group, but there is sometimes that we break out into age level groups. Having I mean, as you know, and as anyone who works in SDE or other similar models know, like multi-age classrooms are optimal. And so underutilized. And I don't understand why. Like anyone who works in a system with multi-age groups can attest to the fact that it's so effective, and there's so many positives that come. There's this misunderstanding that only the younger kids benefit from it, but I think the older kids benefit more than the younger ones. So having these fifth graders get practice their leadership skills on a regular basis is something that they would never get in a typical classroom.
I agree wholeheartedly. So how is your microschool structured? Is it a recognized private school? Is it homeschoolers that are able to attend? How are you structured organizationally?
It's a private school. Surprisingly, the laws pertaining to private schools in Oregon are very, very lax. So there's not a lot of regulations around private schools. So most of the regulations relate to things like building codes. So yeah, we're a private school, but we don't even have to be, officially recognized by the state. We can just operate as is.
Great. And so how do you deal with access, right? Because if you're a private school, parents need to pay tuition, presumably, to attend. How do you make your program more accessible? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when I started Activate, as you know, it's just a summer camp, and it was an LLC because that was the simplest thing to do. And then as it morphed into a school, I'm realizing that there's some limitations there. So in the next few years, I am going to convert it into a nonprofit, because this is a concern. So there's the Vila Fund, which I think most people watching this are probably aware of them by now. They offer money to organizations like Activate, grant money. So I did write a grant for some scholarship funds, and I do have some scholarship money. So if there's anyone in the Portland area listening, reach out to me. But my vision is that the reason that the Vila is so wonderful is because I couldn't find any other grants that would give money to schools or to anyone who's not a nonprofit. So like virtually all of the grant money out there is strictly for nonprofits, which I get. That makes sense. So because we're not a nonprofit, we don't have a lot of options. But yeah, I would like to eventually become a nonprofit, so that way we could get more grants and people donating, so I could offer more scholarships for lower income students.
That's great. Yeah, the Vela Education Fund is great. And as you say, not only providing micro grants to nonprofits and LLCs, but also a whole variety of educational philosophies and approaches. So they're, agnostic when it comes to what you're doing. They just want to support education entrepreneurs who are building non-traditional models. So great to see that you've been able to use those funds to expand access to Activate. And expansion is on the horizon for you. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what your goals are in terms of expanding. Do you want to go to more grades? Do you want to open additional sites? You said you don't want to become a big private school. You want to stay small. Tell us about what some of your goals are.
I think there's a lot of parents and people in the community asking me about middle school grades. So that's sort of the next obvious area to expand into. There were some plans earlier. Well, when I was kind of initially planning this year, I was thinking about having this be a middle school as well, but I just realized that I think I was trying to take on more than I could handle. So what I envision in the next, and not next year, because a lot of parents were like, well, what about next year? I'm like, I can't do anything next year. It's too early. I just moved into a new space. But I think eventually having a separate site for the middle school grades. And then I would also like eventually to have a separate site to do K1, 2. So this space, the space that I would focus on would be 3, 4, 5. Those are the grades that I know best and kind of most passionate about. But then there would be possibly 2 other sites doing one doing K1, 2 and one doing the middle school. And I like the size. You know, there's we have this idea that the way that school has to work is you have to have, 20 to 30 kids in one room, and the room's like 1,000 square feet or something like that, which is really too small. And then they have to be in a building with 500 other kids, and that's just how school's meant to be. And but when you look at the preschool models, that's not how they are. It's kind of like this. It's like 20 kids in a space, and everyone knows each other. And the parents come in, they talk to other parents, and it's just like a very intimate sort of space. And I really want to keep it that way. Now, financially, having a larger space would make more sense if I'm doing kindergarten through 8th or whatever. Just paying rent on 3 different spaces would be a lot, but I think there is something really special about having one space for your school, and like have it be a small amount of kids that all kind of know each other, and the parents all know each other. And during the COVID years, it was really hard because the space was small. And parents weren't allowed in because of the COVID rules. Like the parents had to wait outside. And now we have this much larger space, and parents can kind of come in and out, and it's just it's so much nicer than 2020.
Yeah, and you're still seeing that interest in your program grow, even as schools are basically back to normal at this point. I wonder if you can talk about what you see as sort of the future of education, not only in the microschool movement where you see that going, but also what influence do you think it will have, if any, on conventional schools, especially as a former public school teacher? Do you see them adapting to this special, smaller model, or what?
I see microschools flourishing. Like I see that. I see, there's not a lot in Portland. Like listening to your podcast, I was kind of amazed at how many microschools are out there, and how it seems like there's certain areas that have kind of clusters of microschools, which is fascinating to me. There's really, only 2 or 3 in Portland that in this area that I know of. But I do see those growing. I think it's important for founders like me and others to network. So it's one of my aspirations for this year is to network with other teachers and other people who are interested in this, so we can grow it. Like I don't want to see other microschools as competition. I want to see us all as a community that we can kind of grow and help each other out, and have like a microschool fair where we can, all set up tables and get prospective parents. And like there's private school fairs, but they cater to these schools that are very exclusive private schools. And like, I don't know, I'm just not really interested in that community as much. So I do see microschools growing. I really want to see our neighborhood schools prosper. I mean, I feel like I've spent so much time in those buildings, and I know how much there's a lot of commitment, and there's a lot of really, I think, virtually all of the adults who are working in public education mean really well. They have the best of intentions. They really want to do right by their kids. And I think having those public schools as these sort of, cornerstones of the community, I think that's really important. I would really like to see them prosper. I think in the immediate future, the public school situation in this area is looking a little grim. I don't know what it's going to take for them to turn things around, but I certainly want to see them be successful. But how things are going right now, it's going to take a lot. And people, even though people I think have really great intentions and mean well, they're also fairly entrenched in their ways of thinking about things. The whole systems are just kind of built around some of these core beliefs that just really need to be challenged.
So if there are listeners of mine who want to strike out on their own, what advice do you have for them?
My advice would be to first off, have a good plan in place. Know that you don't need to start with a microschool. You can build up to that. So if you're a teacher and you're looking to maybe get into this, you can branch off into tutoring or summer camps, because that was always one of my fears before COVID and starting up a school. I'm like, well, I have money. I could rent out a space and I could rent and I could call it a school. But what if like I don't get any students, So sort of building it up. So, when you're ready to convert it into a school, there's enough families in your network that you can, that can join your school. I think learning about the regulations in your city and state is really important. So doing your homework. Like I was listening, I can't remember who I was listening to. It was someone on your podcast was talking about how someone in their network was trying to open up a microschool, and they realized they had to like install an elevator in their building. It's like, and when I was checking out spaces, so what I said earlier that in Oregon, the rules for private schools are fairly lax, like very lax actually, but the regulations pertaining to building codes is the challenge. So when you're checking out buildings, like you might see a space that you think is great, and then you rent it, and then you realize that you have to do $100,000 worth of seismic upgrades. So you have to understand the guidelines before you even start to look at spaces, because most of the commercial spaces in this city, I can't speak to what the regulations are like in other cities, but in this city, most commercial spaces will not work for a school. What I found is it already had to be a school, so the occupancy code already needs to be for education. It doesn't really matter the state of the building. If it was already deemed a school, then you can actually just move in, it's fine. Or you need to move into essentially brand new construction, and then you still have to do a few things to make it work. So I would say understanding the regulations is really important. And lastly, and I know this sounds silly, but just learning how to use spreadsheets is really important. I'm constantly going onto my spreadsheet and just messing around with numbers and figuring out how I'm going to make things work financially. How many camps that I need to do, how much I need to be charging in tuition. I do a tiny bit of tutoring on the side, so I'm like, well, how much tutoring do I need? So it's just constantly looking at the number, or if that's not a strength of yours, then hiring someone who's able to do that sort of thing.
Oh, all such great advice. And I especially love your advice of having that successful financial model, making sure that you're approaching whatever new education endeavor you are pursuing with that kind of serious business acumen that you're treating it like a business with spreadsheets, kind of what you need to do to make it financially successful. So that's really helpful. And Greg, I wonder if my listeners want to connect with you and learn more about Activate School and collaborate. I think that you're absolutely right, that the founders, certainly that I've talked to, are incredibly collaborative and open to sharing and connecting with others. There's very little competition, thankfully, at this point. So if others want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so they could connect via email. It's greg@activateschoolpdx.com.
Wonderful. Greg Brown, thank you again for being on the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.